Hi, I'm Brother Norman. I'm from St. Vincent Archabbey, St. Vincent College, and it is indeed a pleasure to introduce our speaker, Monsignor James Shea, this afternoon. I suspect that Jim kind of gets tired of being identified as the youngest president in the United States at age 34. But after 8 years at the University of Mary, you're now, I think, like maybe number 2 in our ABCU. So whether it's youth or seniority, you can always kind of enjoy Benedict's rule that says that you need to pay attention to what young people have to say, or you may look at that opportunity of being a porter in some monastery where the abbot has identified you as the wise man who knows the right word in speaking with guests. Okay. In terms of Jim's education, you want to think of a little bit of diversity. So you have philosophy at Catholic U, theology at the Greg, Greek at Texas, business at the University of Chicago, education at Harvard. Okay. So there is, in this young man, a kind of breadth of experience that one would be surprised at. He has always had an extraordinary passion, I would say, for priestly youth ministry. And I refer you to a TED Talk, Get Over Yourself, okay, that you can find that Jim Shea did. Just Google, TED Talk, James Shea, you'll find it. But you'll hear in his presentation, in his style, that kind of passion and commitment to youth. I've had the good fortune to serve together with Jim on the executive committee for ABCU, and can tell you that we count on his insight, we count on his prodding. Benedictines have a tendency at times to say, well, if this generation doesn't do it, the next generation will. So we talked about videos, the one that you saw last night, for probably about 5 or 6 years until Jim says, well, maybe we could move this along, and I have somebody that I know that could put some pieces together. So what you saw was something that without Jim's initiative, it just was kind of very slowly progressing over the years. I've not yet had a chance to go to the University of Mary. I look forward at some point getting there, and can only imagine the kind of vibrancy that has been created in a challenging situation where Jim replaced Sister Thomas, 31 years as president, icon there, and I think carved out his own kind of niche, which is important to try not to just replicate what had gone before. But this university now has some programs in Rome, Peru, Arizona State. Okay? But I'm especially interested in hearing today what Jim might have to say about the contribution of monasticism to the rise of the modern university. It is with great pride I introduce Monsignor James Shea.
Brother Norman, you might have my text there.
Oh, I do. I was so interested.
Yes, that's right. He stole my text. Otherwise, I would have just given you my TED Talk. Everybody, I'm happy to be here with you. I'm happy to be able to address the part of this conference which evidently is not in the know. Upstairs, they're having a talk on the Benedict option, which is very trendy in our moment, of course, with Rod Dreher's book and following upon some of the thoughts of Alistair McIntyre before. And so it's good to be here with you in the least desirable hour in which one could ever give a talk, right after lunch. I'm in worse shape than you are, though. I've not so long ago returned from our campus in Rome, and so I'm feeling a little bit of jet lag. And it reminds me of a story that a friend of mine told when he went over to Rome for meetings. And he landed and had only time to wash his face before the meetings began, and he felt so tired. And so he went back and he got a shot of espresso, and then he got another one. And they didn't seem to help at all. And so he said to an Italian who was attending the meeting, he said, "I've had 2 shots of espresso and they don't seem to help me at all." And the person said, "Well, you know that in Italy, there's less caffeine in our coffee than in America, and so it won't have that effect as readily as it would have back home for you." And my friend said, "Well, but what do you do when you get tired?" And the Italian looked at him quizzically and said, "When we get tired, we go to sleep." The title of this presentation is "The Monastic Influence on the Rise of the Modern University." It's a topic that holds a good deal of interest, and for many reasons. I'd like to pursue the topic with you and to broaden it a bit to make some suggestions as to how the history of monasticism's involvement with the university can present some paths of wisdom for us amid current challenges and possibilities. Of course, for those of us who are in higher education, there are a lot of issues of significant concern in our time. Questions of financing and recruitment, the changing nature of our society and the corresponding changes in the needs of our students, of the distinctive nature of Catholic institutions of higher education and what our particular contribution might be. For the most part, I'm going to dodge specifically practical aspects of those important questions and focus instead on a set of more fundamental matters that are of importance in themselves and that might be of use to us as we tackle the more immediate affairs that are daily coming across our desks. And here's how I'll go about this task. I'll attempt to trace through a series of 6 historical developments, chapters, snapshots, if you will, that will give the broad outline and what I take to be the key principles in the historic relationship between the monastery and the university. Then I'll draw some conclusions from that history that point to our present reality and to our future hopes. But first, I want to just make a general remark about the monastery and the university. I want to point out what I take to be a particularly interesting aspect of this relationship, of how monasteries led in their own way to the rise of universities. And this is inspired from several sources, but I continue to be fascinated years after reading it by an address that Pope Emeritus Benedict XVI gave at the Collège des Bernardins, which had been the Cistercian college of the University of Paris in the Middle Ages, but which, if you ever have a chance to go to Paris, you should go and see this place, which has been renovated by the French state into an extraordinary museum and exhibit on monasticism, and the feel of it is very special. It's an extraordinary place. Anyway, in 2008, Pope Benedict was there and gave an address to the ministers of culture. And he made a series of observations. And when you read them, you can intuit or put together that 2 statements can be made about the relationship between monasteries and universities that when you put them side by side, present an historically intriguing and I think suggestive and fruitful line of thinking. Here are the 2 statements. First, it was no part of the intention, either of the founders and early monks of the Egyptian desert in the 4th century, or of Benedict and his foundations in the 6th century. It was no part of their intention to set up centers of learning, especially not of higher education. That wasn't what they were setting out to do. But also, monasteries consistently became such centers of higher learning, not accidentally, but from the nature of the monastic vocation itself. When you think of those 2 things, intention and result, there's something fascinating, at least for me. I don't know what you think in your after-lunch stupor, but I'm always invigorated when I think about providentially what all of that might mean. And so we encounter here a situation whose development would have been very hard to predict, and yet in retrospect has seemed clear and even obvious. Perhaps there are lessons from the future to be gained from this. Anyway, let's plunge into 6 chapters or snapshots. First, early Christianity and the Greek philosophical tradition. The first snapshot comes before the rise of monasticism, and it has to do with Christianity as a whole. In a remarkable development that isn't always noted, Christians, when they were looking for a way to build upon the existing traditions of the ancient world, did not present themselves or see themselves as fulfilling pagan religion. Instead, they understood themselves as fulfilling pagan philosophy. Most ancient religion actually had little to do with the pursuit of truth for its own sake. It was primarily occupied in rituals and practices that mollified or placated the gods, or gained for the believer an insertion into the cycle of nature. In a broad sense, neither moral behavior nor philosophical realities held much interest for paganism. And so Socrates was attacked as an atheist, as were the early Christians for a similar reason. Socrates, and the tradition he represented and helped found, was not at all irreligious in the way we would now use the term, but he was very much interested in the nature of reality. What's the mystery that runs under all things? This is what Socrates wanted to know. He wanted to know what was true scientifically, metaphysically, morally, the whole thing. He found the myths and the personalities of the Greek gods to be silly and depraved, and for that reason he drew the anger of their defenders. Christians found in this attitude of Socrates and in the Greek philosophical tradition as a whole much to admire and much that corresponded with the revelation they had been given of a God who created the world through the Logos, through reason, order, and rationality. Christians were disdainful of pagan religion and either ignored it or attacked it. But on the whole, I'm setting people like Tertullian aside, on the whole, they honored pagan philosophy. They claimed to be the true philosophers who built on what the pagans had begun to understand but did not fully comprehend. In his letter to the Ephesians, Paul gets at this attitude, both toward paganism and toward the Christian way forward. He writes, "I declare and solemnly attest in the Lord that you must no longer live as the pagans do, their minds empty, their understanding darkened. They are estranged from a life in God because of their ignorance." Justin Martyr and Clement of Alexandria are two examples of early fathers who embraced the persona of the philosopher, insisting that Christ was the true philosopher and Christians were the true heirs to that tradition. You know that Justin Martyr's feast was yesterday. He was born a pagan, this guy. He kind of trammeled all over every area of ancient thought. He was born a pagan. He became early in his inquiry a Stoic. Then he was a Peripatetic, a tradition associated with Aristotle. Then he was a Pythagorean. Perhaps he became a Cynic after that, and then he wound up a Platonist. What did Thomas More say to the man who wanted to be his son-in-law, according to Robert Bold? "When your head quits spinning, I hope that it's facing forward again." All this before Justin Martyr chanced upon an old man, a Syrian Christian, who astonished him with what he took to be the true philosophy. Justin converted around the year 130 AD, and he continued to dress himself in the traditional garb of a philosopher. Here's how he spoke about the experience. "A fire was suddenly kindled in my soul. I fell in love with the prophets and these men who had loved Christ. I reflected on all their words and found that this philosophy alone was true and profitable. This is how and why I became a philosopher, and I wish everyone felt the same way that I do." This Christian embrace of the Greek philosophical tradition, a pattern that was already well underway among the Jews, think of the great school of translation at Alexandria, this was a momentous event in the history of world religions. For our purposes, it's important to note that it had this consequence, that anyone who was attempting to be a devout Christian would by necessity be pursuing truth, the whole of reality, not just the performance of rites and sacrifices, but the embrace by the mind of the truth of God, the renewal of the mind that Paul speaks about in the 12th chapter of his letter to the Romans. This renewal of the mind was the goal of every Christian, even the uneducated. So there's my first snapshot. And the second is this: the monks flee Christian society. When Anthony of the Desert fled into the Egyptian desert in the late 3rd century, he inaugurated one of the most potent movements in the history of the church. With the help of Athanasius' famous biography, Anthony became a kind of Christian hero, and monks began to populate the deserts of Egypt and Syria. It's important to note that they were not fleeing a dark pagan world. Sometimes this is how you read it in the history books, that the early monks of the desert were fleeing this dark pagan world. They were fleeing a society that was rapidly becoming Christian, and they were looking for a kind of martyrdom, a witness that was no longer as easily available at the hands of the Romans. And they went into the waste places to live a heroic life of faith and, by their own account, to fight the demons who had been chased out of the churches of the cities. The same was true for Benedict, as he aided in the translation of the life of Eastern monasticism to a movement so potent and successful in the West. The desire of Benedict and his followers was to seek God and to pray, nothing else, not the saving of a culture or even evangelization except by prayer, or the development of the higher intellectual faculties, simply to seek God and to create an ordered life whose every contour could make sure that that search was successful. Nevertheless, in a development that can be seen in every age, as the monastic fled the world pursued the monastic. For instance, the monk, by his decision to leave everything behind and to seek God, showed himself to be free of worldly ambition and to be unbribable. And so they were accorded great respect and were often pressed into service as judges and pastors and guides by those who lived in the midst of the world's business. Part 3. The monastery as a school of Christian discipleship. When Benedict, in his rule, called the monastery a school of the Lord's service, he wasn't using the word school the way we tend to use it now. But there were reasons why his monasteries did become schools of this more formal kind by an inner necessity of monastic, common Christian life. Because Christianity was a religion of civilization that demanded the ability to read in order to perform the liturgy and study the sacred writings, and the ability to think through difficult biblical texts and teach them to others, any group of disciples, and especially monastics, would need to train at least some of their members in reading and writing and in theology. The Christian faith has always had the effect of leading its followers into ever deeper intellectual engagement with that which is real. For example, the Apostle John was a fisherman, certainly not a highly trained scholar like Paul. But as he thought about the life of Christ in order to bring that life to others, he developed profound theological insights, such that in the East he has often been called John the Theologian. This will always be the effect of Christianity on at least some minds. It leads to careful and profound thought about the deepest metaphysical realities. And because the world was created by God and was therefore good and created through the Logos and therefore ordered, the study of the natural world could also lead to knowledge of the mind of God, which was at the heart of monastic desire. And so something else happened. It became an organic and natural development that monastic centers would become, through the years, places of very broad learning. And I'm talking about learning that goes well beyond reading and writing and the study of Scripture and discourse about theology. First for the study of Scriptures, yes, then for the study of the created world that gave evidence of its creator, monks began to cultivate impressive intellectual traditions. Certain other developments followed by necessity. Learning demanded books. Books needed to be copied out and preserved. So monasteries, as self-sufficient societies, became libraries and bookmaking concerns too. In this monastic development can be seen something of the way that Christianity was the continuation and the fulfillment of the Greek philosophical tradition. Plato's Academy, an institution that has given its name to the whole of our established academic endeavor, the academy was much more like a monastery than one of our modern schools or universities. It was a moral and spiritual as well as an intellectual community. The groves of academe was a spot sacred to the divine, many of whose members would live the whole of their lives within its walls. The ancients thought that in order to perceive the deepest truths, in order to become a true philosopher, a person needed to turn his or her back on the distractions of normal life and pursue a life of contemplation in community with others. The monastery was thus the continuation of two different traditions brought into fruitful contact: the Hebrew tradition of a John the Baptist or of the Essenes of Qumran, going out into the desert to live an austere and prophetic life, and the Greek tradition of the seeker for truth who converted to philosophy and entered a community of truth seekers. Athens, it turns out, did have quite a bit to do with Jerusalem. A famous work by the Benedictine Jacques Leclerc was titled Love of Learning and the Desire for God, a study of monastic culture. The love of learning and the desire for God. The monastery, heirs to both of these traditions, Greek learning and Hebrew faith, also provided a kind of antidote to the opposite errors that tended to crop up when one or other of these partners was excluded. Either, one, pursuing knowledge without faith for reasons of pride. Knowledge puffs up, St. Paul says in his first letter to the Corinthians. Knowledge puffs up, love builds up. Or two, seeking God without proper training of the mind. Once again, the 12th chapter of Romans, be transformed by the renewal of your minds. The monastic remembered these twin truths, not easily combined, that he or she was both a sinner in need of salvation and a child of God who was meant to understand the length and breadth and height and depths of all reality. How are we doing out there? I'm going to Snapshot 4, and I see the yawns, and I don't blame you at all. 4, the monastery as a cultural anchor in a time of decay. As monasticism continued to develop and spread in the West, it proved to be a form of life particularly suited to a time of cultural decay. As the power of the Roman Empire waned, and people whose material culture was at a far lower level infiltrated and inhabited the old empire, communities which could function as centers of cultural and economic stability began to play a significant role in stabilizing local life and in carrying the learning of the ancient world forward. First among the monasteries of England and Ireland, then later in the monastic reform centered around the glorious and fascinating name of Cluny, the monastery emerged as the key social institution of Europe. The great monasteries became centers not only of philosophical and theological learning, but of all the arts, to adorn the liturgy, for instance, architecture, music, art. The monks, gave a soundscape. There's Father Bob Koopman back there with piano playing in his mind. The monks gave to Europe a soundscape, which became then the basis, the foundation for all of the classical music tradition. And the workings of the lands of the monasteries put the monasteries at the forefront of many material developments in agriculture, animal husbandry, and accounting. And so many things culturally grew up out of the monastery in an unlooked-for way. That's not what the monks sought to do. That wasn't the heart of the monastic vocation. And yet, by an extraordinary and breathtaking set of circumstances, needs, and historical developments, the monasteries became the great social centers of cultural preservation, integrity, and vibrancy. They even gave to the world many fine drinks. The great influence of these monasteries has given St. Benedict, by virtue of what happened after his time, the title the Father of Europe. Examples of the intellectual excellence of monastic culture are legion. In the 7th and 8th centuries, Bede the Venerable and Alcuin of York, both monks, were the most learned names in Europe. Anselm and Lanfranc, also monks, were luminaries of the 11th century. Hildegard of Bingen was a marvel of intellectual breadth in the 11th century. In the 12th century, as was Gertrude the Great in the 13th. These and a host of other less well-known carried much of the learning of those centuries. Monasteries had always conducted schools for the training of their own members and their own needs, but they began to take in other students, and some monasteries became impressive centers of scholarship and learning, which leads us to the 5th snapshot, the rise of the medieval university. Given the development that I've just described, it's not surprising that as the hunger for learning continued to grow and medieval society grew wealthier and more prosperous, the monastic schools, along with their counterparts in the city, the cathedral schools, were the institutions out of which the intellectual explosion of the medieval university took place, somewhere around the year 1200. The dates are disputed, but this one will do to give a general idea. Somewhere around the year 1200, the first universities, which was another name for guild, were established in Paris and Bologna. Dozens of universities soon followed in all the other major cities of Europe. Think of Oxford and Cambridge and Salamanca. The university emerged as one of the three great pillars of medieval society, along with the papacy and the imperial crown. And this was important because the medieval mind was ordered. There was an ordered type of curiosity around it, such that this category of the university began to represent not just its own material reality, but an ideal in the midst of society as well. So you remember this scene from the life of Eugène Emmanuel Viollet-le-Duc, who was the architect who renovated and restored Notre Dame in Paris after the ravages of the French Revolution. One time when he was a little boy, his mother took him into the transept of the great cathedral, and he saw the rose window, and he saw all the light coming, streaming through it, and he said, "Écoute, maman, c'est la rosace qui chante." Listen, mama, the rose is singing. It's singing. Of course, what he was perceiving was in the rose window what the medievals had built in every component and aspect of their architecture and their art and even their literature, that there was an order to things. So, for instance, beauty for them had three essential components: integritas, wholeness, consonantia, harmony, the parts fitting together, and claritas, radiance. To be beautiful, you had to shine. And so these three elements make up beauty. So too, medieval society was composed of these three components: the papacy, the imperial crown, and the university. Think of how it would be today if our universities were seen as one of three fundamental components without which society would have no idea what it was. Wow. These institutions represented ideally the great medieval quest for order and the all-embracing cosmic vision of life. The papacy was the realm of God's invisible kingdom. The empire was the political realm of human beings living together. And the realm of the university was the ordering of the intellect. The university was a complex development that arose from various sources, but a key one was the long tradition carried forward by the monastics. Monastics soon set up colleges at the new universities, and many monks, both Cluniac and Cistercian, were masters and doctors in the universities. And the mendicant orders, who are often given so much credit around this time and in this period, the Dominicans and the Franciscans and the Augustinians, though they developed their own important and distinctive university culture, they grew out of the earlier monastic foundations. And so we think of the people like St. Thomas Aquinas or St. Bonaventure, who were early professors at the universities and mendicants, but of course they owed very much. Well, there was a saying for the mendicants, which was not meant to be complimentary. The Franciscans and the Dominicans were monastics who had somehow gotten loose of the cloister and were running around. Thus, both explicitly and obliquely, the development of the medieval university had so much to do with monastic tradition, which brings me to my final snapshot, the rise of the modern secular university. The medieval university is in many respects still with us. Many of our institutional forms, many of the things which would be familiar to all of us, from the names of our degrees to the very style of our academic gowns, these things have come down to us from our medieval ancestors. So also has something of the grandeur of the life of the mind. Western civilization has been remarkable for the emphasis it has placed on the development of the intellect, an emphasis that is not unconnected from the place of reason in Christian belief and the way that that relationship was pursued by generations of monastics. So it's not accidental that our history has seen the development of sophisticated theological and philosophical traditions, as well as the extraordinary growth of the study of natural science. In one sense, then, it could be said that the modern university is a continuation of the medieval university. And in tracing the monastic influence up to that point, we've noted some key developments. From that point on, it can be claimed, universities have indeed developed their studies in impressive ways, such that our grasp of many aspects of knowledge it's far beyond anything that the medievals ever possessed. But it could also be said that this has been a consistent development along the lines that they first set up, and in that sense, not a departure, but a growth and expansion from the original vision of the university. What I've just done is I've tried to make a gradual entrance into a controversial point. So first, there is so much which is in continuity that we've inherited from the foundations of the first medieval institutions that we call universities, in which they had inherited from the wider tradition. But now I want to speak a little bit about discontinuity, because in at least one crucial sense, the modern university has seen what can be rightly described as a revolution. I don't mean the specific development of science and technology, or the ways that modern universities now function differently from the way that they did previously. This could be seen as an adaptation of any social institution that's experienced as it makes its way through a changing world. Take the institution of the papacy, for instance. It's gone through so many changes through the centuries. No one would suggest that its exercise now is the same as it was in the 18th or the 16th or the 13th or the 9th centuries. Yet despite changes, it wouldn't make sense to speak about a revolution in the fundamental idea of the papacy. But the revolution that I'm speaking of has to do with a very definite and specific definition of knowledge. A university obviously is concerned with the life of the mind, the pursuit and dissemination of knowledge. What is so radically changed in the modern university is not only that we have more knowledge than we had previously, or that we pass it on differently. It's rather that the modern university understands and defines knowledge in ways significantly different from the original universities. Simply, perhaps too simply put, the modern secular university, following the broad vision of modern society, holds, this is why we can reasonably call it secular, holds that the only knowledge worthy of the name, the only knowledge with which a university is rightly concerned, is what can be determined according to a narrow rule, what is empirically demonstrable or logically provable. Other areas of human inquiry, whether moral or spiritual or philosophical, are not genuine knowledge, but only expressions of opinion, maybe even of taste. Do you see what I'm getting at and how revolutionary this really is? The concept of knowledge as something which only can be that which is logically provable or empirically demonstrable, that's the whole domain of knowledge, is very different from the original conception. This is the conviction, for instance, around the rise of the modern research university. So when the University of London was founded in the early 1800s, it was founded specifically as an alternative to Oxford and Cambridge because they didn't want theology included in the curriculum. It was the same with the establishment of the University of Berlin. And when the University of Michigan was founded, it came out of that same Prussian tradition which had founded the University of Berlin, specifically to exclude anything beyond that which could be verifiable in this limited sense of knowledge. This revolution in the understanding of what knowledge is a departure not just from the Christian understanding of knowledge, it's also a departure from that of the Greeks. Both Greek and Christian held that philosophy, morality, theology, along with the natural and social sciences, were types of genuine knowledge, and that such studies were not only suited to a university setting, but were among the most important aspects of knowledge possible to pursue. This radical reduction in the definition of knowledge has brought about, among other things, two developments. First, the place of a specifically Catholic, or in our case, Benedictine university, has come under scrutiny. The comment is sometimes heard that a Catholic university is a contradiction in terms. When you consider the history of the rise of universities, this seems like an odd accusation, since it was Catholics who invented the university as an institutional form. But it makes sense. This accusation makes sense if once the assumption is embraced that faith has nothing to do with reason, and that a university has nothing to do with God, the supernatural, the moral, or the soul. When I was about the work of teaching, I was teaching in the wake of September 11th. And indeed, when I began teaching, the students all had vivid memories of what it was like on that day, how their teachers had turned on the television on time to see the second tower tumble. And I was struck by the fact that our students are living in a time which is both increasingly secular and more radically religious at the same time. And that our work has to do with equipping them to grapple with this reality. And what's striking about what I'm noting here is that the fundamental premise of both radical secularists and fundamentalist religious fundamentalists, the common premise of both religious fundamentalists and secular radical secularists is the same premise. Faith and reason have nothing to do with each other. It's the same premise. They agree on that, and then they diverge in radically different ways to different conclusions. But this is something which is alien to our tradition, because we've always said that if you and I have different viewpoints, if you and I have different beliefs, that we have a responsibility to give an account for our faith, that we have a responsibility to engage in that. And because the human person is perceived as being rational, and because issues religious, theological, philosophical, and moral fall in the realm of the rational, because they're not just matters of simple opinion or personal taste, you and I can talk reasonably, and you might be able to convince me of something, and I might be able to convince you of something, and at least we'll respect each other. In the absence of that, all that's left is for you to cut off my head. And this is the reality which a radical divorce between faith and reason leaves us with. And we, friends, we have the patrimony to be able to put forth a different vision for our students, which will equip them in a fundamental and deeply existential way to navigate the brave new world in which we find ourselves. Secondly, the secular university has increasingly gone into something of a crisis. As schools for the technical professions, the universities continue to march forward with confidence. But in the humanities, in the social sciences, it's becoming increasingly clear that there's no cogent basis for these studies under the secular understanding of knowledge. Has anybody seen this book by Harry Lewis, who was the dean of Harvard College? He wrote a book, I think in 2006, called Excellence Without a Soul, in which he talked about how nobody's turning to universities anymore to ask the deep and the most haunting questions of human life. They turn on television talk shows. They go to the self-help section of the local bookstore. But universities, according to Harry Lewis and according to many others, have become hapless in terms of assisting people to decipher those aspects of life. Even in the applied sciences, our universities are finding themselves with limited answers and with no basis for coming up with answers to the most serious questions facing all of us, questions of geopolitics, or the morality of war, or the current economic developments, the limits, if any, of increasingly powerful technologies that claim to alter the very constitution of what it means to be human. Everybody is looking for answers to these questions. It's increasingly apparent that no one will be finding those answers in the typical modern secular university. Thus, we find ourselves in an interesting time. We're part of a great tradition of learning and of institutions devoted to learning, universities, at a time when key aspects of that tradition have been largely abandoned. And the resulting institutions are having a hard time maintaining themselves without support of an overarching founding of overarching understanding of the cosmos that was behind the original founding of universities. It's as if flowers have been cut, beautiful blooming flowers cut from their roots, placed in a vase, and the blossom holds, but not for long. How are we doing? I tried at first to inspire you, to wake you up, and then I just got really gloomy. And cynicism sells, everyone. So I have a few observations, actually 5, in the midst of all of this. Where can we go from here, given the historical development that we've traced through as we think about the rise of universities from the monastic way of life? How surprising and fascinating it was that they came forth from the vocation of people who were seeking God alone and who weren't interested in, the monks didn't put together a strategic plan for the flowering of learning, but they achieved it. This is providence. So what can we figure out from all of this? First, there's a connection between monasticism and intellectual excellence. To go back to the point I made at the beginning of this presentation, it seems that the monastic vocation somehow gives rise naturally, maybe supernaturally, to the pursuit of intellectual excellence. If this is the case, and a very long history would suggest that it is, then there are good grounds for hope and also for renewed determination that as we follow out the lines of our deepest call, as we live faithfully our vocation, we'll find that intellectual seriousness and an impulse toward excellence will arise from a faithful life. I'm not here suggesting that we need address nothing else, or that fine universities will magically appear when monastics are living their vocation well. I don't know anything about that. I know that when diocesan priests all begin to live their vocations well, the world will come to an end. But I am insisting that the connection between monastic faithfulness and intellectual excellence is not accidental, but it's natural, and that one feeds the other. We might put it as a necessary condition, if not a sufficient one, that for serving the intellectual needs and helping to heal the intellectual wounds of our time, we continue to rediscover the graces of the monastic life. Pursued in itself and for its own sake, or rather for the sake of Christ, not with a utilitarian end, but simply because we are called to it, both those in our monastic communities and those of us who participate in our own way in the Benedictine charism. Seek first the kingdom, and all these things will be added as well. This has been our history, writ large, the history of the whole monastic movement. And we can have confidence that this principle spoken by Christ will be continually effective in our time as well. There's a connection between monasticism, lived well, and intellectual excellence. Second, the necessary place of faith and revelation in the intellectual project. The great vision that motivated both the monks and the early universities was one of an ordered cosmos being held in being by a loving creator who wanted to share his life and his mind with humanity. This meant that the pursuit of truth and the sharpening of the intellect were intimately connected to knowing that God and being familiar with what he was revealing to humans. When the founders of Oxford took as its motto, Deus illuminatio mea, the Lord is my light, they were not being spiritual or devotional. They were elucidating a principle of knowledge. If God is creator, and if he created the world in an ordered fashion, and if he has revealed himself and is something of his mind to humans, then knowledge of God will logically lead to knowledge of all things in multiple interrelations. Christians hold to all of these ifs, and they therefore hold to the intellectual principle that knowledge of God is key to a right knowledge of anything and everything. Paying attention to this can help us avoid the mistake of leaving faith out of the university's intellectual project and relegating it to a circumscribed space we call campus ministry, rather than holding the consistent view that to know the one who created the world and ourselves and who has revealed much of himself and his purposes is to gain a great advantage in understanding pretty much everything. We need to resist the reduction of the definition of knowledge that has so plagued the modern university and the modern mind. Third, and here on this one, I think I'm touching upon something which is of particular urgency for our own time, and an opportunity for our specific institutions with which, if we mine it, if we engage it, will make our institutions the most impressive and helpful of any institutions of higher learning in this country. And it's this: monastic contemplation, the rhythm of monastic life, the way our sponsors and founders move and live, is a healing remedy for the distraction of our time. Monastics have always spent time in contemplation. It's their specific métier, their specialty. The connection between contemplation and understanding reality has such a long and noble history and explains much of why so many wise and knowledgeable people have inhabited monasteries, convents, priories. This has been a perennial advantage of monastic life. But in our age, a call to contemplation takes on a very contemporary importance. Has there ever been a time when we as a society have been so constantly distracted? We have at our fingertips the means to keep our minds and spirits incessantly occupied and burdened by an unending stream of fascinating but usually superficial and ultimately unsatisfying images and sounds. If knowledge is pursued best by the contemplative, which of course is the ancient wisdom, by those whose spirits have been seasoned by silence and taught to distinguish the important from the superfluous by long discipline, what a great service can the monastic ideal provide to our age precisely in the area of university studies. Monasteries have long been places of hospitality where the travel-worn have been given rest, the hungry got good food, the wayfarer a place to stop, the troubled a place of peace. Has there ever been a time when such hospitality, not so much of the body, but of the mind, is a burning necessity by so many around us? This, I think, is a new or an added way of our understanding hospitality, which is, of course, one of our common values as Benedictines. Sometimes in our institutions, we ascribe to a diminished view of hospitality, or of a view in which hospitality simply becomes an incantation which is connected with inclusion. It has that meaning to a certain extent, but what I'm suggesting here is that we can take hospitality to a deeper level, where it's something like what Pope Francis means when he says that he wants the church to be a field hospital, where people who have experienced the wounds of our time can go for respite, rest, healing, and care. I'm proofing a book for a friend called A Mind at Peace, and here are the opening paragraphs. Have you ever regretted an email, text, or post? Have you recently forgotten an appointment that a year or two ago you would have had no difficulty remembering? Do you catch your mind wandering when you should be attending carefully to the task or to the person right in front of you? What about the way you have been spending your time? Is it difficult to refrain from checking your phone or email every several minutes? Are you uncomfortable being alone and quick to look for relief from boredom? Do you find yourself browsing websites or trying to keep up with the latest news? Do you fall into binge watching television shows or playing just one more round of video game? Are you preoccupied with social media to the point of compulsively checking updates, statuses, and likes? Are you more often ill at ease or anxious than in the past? Are you uncomfortable with your own thoughts? Do you feel unfocused, distracted, restless? Are you finding less joy in conversation, reading, and prayer than you used to? At the beginning of the freshman year, I give a series of dumb talks to the freshmen. And I mean that they're dumb. They're very simple things. I talk to them about what friendship is like and why they should want to have friends. I talk to them about the relationship between faith and reason, and why having an integrated mind, which is a gift of the liberal arts tradition, could be important for them. I talk about study habits, and I don't deal with general hygiene. I leave that to others. But by far, and very surprising to me, the most potent reaction that I get is when I speak in quite a mild way about technology and its proper use. I simply ask the question, technology, is it a master or is it a servant? And the students respond viscerally to this. These are 18-year-olds. They respond viscerally to this because they know, although they don't have the words for it necessarily, that there's something profoundly disordered about their relationship with technology, and that it has created not simply a life which is burdensome for them, but a kind of deep interior suffering. This is now well documented. Everybody, you've heard, haven't you, of the now famous study at the University of Virginia where students were put in a room by themselves and asked to sit with their thoughts quietly. And the only other alternative to that was a button that they could push which would deliver to them a very painful electric shock. Something like 86% of the men and 47% of the women, rather than sitting for 20 minutes alone with their own thoughts, administered a shock to themselves. Because being alone with their interior life was too painful for them. Nicholas Carr has written a book, The Shallows, about what the internet is doing to our brains. Sherry Turkle has done famous research in this regard. Patricia Snow recently wrote a haunting essay called Look at Me, where she posited that our age has a kind of spiritual autism induced by our addictive dependence upon electronic technology. And our students, for sure, find themselves less settled, more easily manipulated, more often distracted, and more deeply worried. Do you know when they start to nod? When I say, does your phone ever make you anxious? And they nod vigorously, that there's great anxiety that they can identify that comes to them because their profile, an idealized image of themselves, is on several forms of social media, and people are commenting on that. Benedictines are experts at hospitality. All through our history, we have opened doors so that people who were weary and wounded would have a place to rest. What are creative ways in which we can offer Benedictine hospitality to an age which is fully distracted? If we did that and did it well, we would have found the great pearl of price, the pearl of great price for our age. I want to end it. I really am fascinated by this question, and so I've paused on it for a moment. But I was at the funeral of an abbot of our local Benedictine monastery not long ago, and it was going long. It was a long service, and I was in the choir stalls, and this book tumbled into my hands and forced me to begin to read it as a distraction. It's a book called An Unexciting Life, Essays on Monastic Spirituality by an Australian Benedictine called Michael Casey. Here's a paragraph from it. The very idea of living according to an externally generated rule seems absurd to many of our contemporaries who consider it a denial of individual choice and the consequent extinguishment of all creativity. In fact, a consumerist culture constantly confronts us with such a multiplicity of meaningless options that we fritter away all our power of choice through a day-long involvement with making selections between trivialities. As a result, we are so entertained by the illusion of freedom that we never explore its deepest regions, nor are we conscious when its native breath is constrained. What would it mean to have a mind at rest? What would it mean to experience true freedom instead of a parade of meaningless choices, selections? This is a kind of hospitality which we're well suited to offer. Only two more thoughts. First, power or wisdom and love, helping to heal the modern wound. Yet another wound of our time that the monastic spirit might speak to. We have become mighty in scientific knowledge, it's true, but we are mainly fascinated by knowledge that brings us power. I think here of Francis Bacon, who stands at the beginning of the Enlightenment and the modern era. I did my thesis on scientific progress and Francis Bacon. He wrote the first piece of science fiction, The New Atlantis. His most famous saying, of course, is, "Knowledge is power." If you drive around in neighborhoods, you sometimes see it in large murals on the walls of schools. Knowledge is power. And what he means, of course, is that the purpose of knowledge is so that we can have power over nature. In many different directions, we're creating possibilities that have great potential for destruction, whether of the individual soul and the psyche, or of economic and cultural health, destruction of the environment, and even of the human body. Knowledge without the wisdom that comes from calm contemplation and a life ordered to the rhythms of the cosmos leads down a perilous path. If we as academics want to see an instance of prophetic thinking in this regard, pick up again that book, the third in the space trilogy of C.S. Lewis. Do you remember? He wrote in 1945 a book called That Hideous Strength. And it's at turns horrifying and hilarious, taking place in the context of a modern research university with a professor who is full of ambition and finds himself on a road to destruction with a sudden appearance of the wizard Merlin toward the end. But it's good to see, in any case, that hideous strength. Here again, the monastic vocation tied to the pursuit of knowledge speaks to a great need for our age. Benedict centers of learning have the possibility of yoking the pursuit of knowledge to the wisdom of understanding all reality, and so can help an ever more powerful humanity avoid the dangers that come with greater power. Recently, Bishop Daniel Flores, the Bishop of Brownsville, Texas, was on our campus. In February, he came to North Dakota from Texas in February. A great act of love and charity. But he gave our annual Hildegard lecture, in which he noted the intellectual vision of St. Hildegard of Bingen, who was a genius, the breadth of her knowledge, just simply stunning. He talked about her synthetic understanding of knowledge, in which all things speak to each other, in which everything has meaning, as opposed to the analytic approach of knowledge that we embark on today, in which we try and strip away anything which is haunted about our object of study, and therefore only understand things in purely material terms for the manipulation and the advancement of the human estate, a phrase which Francis Bacon used. And of course, his point is that for Hildegard, and for us too, that's not what knowing is about. It's not just so that we can get our teeth whiter that we study. We study for the enrichment of our hearts and souls because we want to know, because knowing is worth it, and because there is a mystery that runs under all things. Lastly, the need for and the promise of renewal in our institutions. All of this points to a great need all around us and the possibility of a significant mission in serving our times. In order to seize that mission, what is no doubt needed is a renewal and revival within the monastic and the Benedictine tradition. Here, I don't mean this as a criticism. I mean, well, it's the 500th anniversary of the Protestant Reformation, so I may as well quote Karl Barth, who had the phrase, "Ecclesia semper reformanda est." The church is always in reform. G.K. Chesterton said that dead things float down the river. You have to be alive to swim up it. And so too, our institutions always have to be in renewal, always have to be in the midst of reform. That may seem a tall, even an impossible order. No one can simply bring about such a renewal by fiat, by stomping around. And we may be dubious about the likelihood of one occurring. But the whole history of the monastic movement and of Benedictinism in particular, is a history of powerful forces of renewal, as energetic women and men in age after age refilled the forms set out by Benedict and Scholastica according to the possibilities and challenges of their times. We are living in times of significant challenge, and correspondingly, we're living in times of great possibility. If we set our hearts to the work, why should we not see what so many before us have seen, and hope and pray and work for a new springtime of Benedictine life and service, another renewed and vibrant incarnation of that school for the Lord's service? In this, may Benedict and Scholastica and all their daughters and sons through the ages pray for us. Thank you. I think we have limited time, yes.
That was a wonderful talk, and unfortunately, I don't think people see universities as search for meaning, significance, and life. They see it as a way to get a job.
Yeah.
And what I get from my students, and even more so from their parents, is why do I need to take that liberal arts course? How does it help me get a job?
Sure.
And the universities have to adapt essentially to the demands of these students because this is what the students are looking for. So I'm not sure how to point them back in the right direction. We tell them that we have this ulterior motive of getting them educated, whether they like it or not.
Yeah.
You know, and they look at you kind of strange. But basically what they're looking for is a job.
Right.
And they want job training, not significance and meaning to life.
And this is a big problem,
Yeah.
because the whole idea of a university, think of the phrase alma mater, which means nurturing mother. It's hard to justify that title for a university if it's a simple transactional arrangement. You give me tuition and I'll give you a degree which makes your skills marketable. Now, the difficulty, of course, is that part of the revolutionary aspect that I was pointing to in the devolution of the breadth of knowledge, that knowledge is simply it has a limited scope, which in a certain practical way can be translated to marketable skills. Part of that means that we need to be thoughtful and honest. In other words, it probably won't do simply for us to recommit ourselves to the liberal arts to the neglect of all sorts of other things. And by the way, the world needs tremendous business people and educators and nurses and all of these things. And so I think the dynamics of internal renewal, and there have been a couple of talks here already during this conference about the importance of hiring for mission. We're talking about what it means to attract and to hire and to retain people who have a capacity for, even if they don't come in the door with a fully formed idea, but who have a capacity for this broader vision and who can communicate that to students. But in the meantime, we need to have programs with which students can get jobs. So I think that's a tall order. We have a Catholic Studies program at the University of Mary, and that's one approach where it's specifically designed as a second major. And so we don't really want anybody just doing Catholic Studies. We want them to do that along with the study of the professions or another field. But that's a way for us to provide for that, the core curriculum, all of those things. But it's a constant task for us. You've raised one of the most difficult of all questions.
Yeah. One of the difficulties that monastic communities are facing today is an increasing professionalization of our work, specifically increasing demand of professional life that takes us away from our monastic grounds, takes us away from living a compelling monastic life, and surely is difficult for somebody with a family to maintain a compelling family life with demands of teaching or administration, etc. What ways do you see forward with this particular challenge?
Yeah, right. So historically, this is a particular problem for Benedictinism in the United States because, of course, when both Benedictine life for women and for men religious migrated to this country, it took on a particular American flair. Americans are the great pragmatists. We just can't help it. We can't. We admire. We admire workaholics. We just love that stuff, and we're pragmatic and practical people. And so the bishops who invited those first monastic communities to come said, "Yeah, by all means come, but here's some schools for you to teach at, and here's some floors for you to mop, and here's some other do all this other stuff." And that was part of, I suppose, the cost of coming. And Ephraim Hollerman, I think, across the way, has written some things about what that meant and how difficult it was. But and so from the very beginning, there's been this difficulty. So I think individual communities need to make choices about that. But what I feel is this: I'm conscious of the fact that our faculty and staff have families and busy lives, and they're running people to soccer practice and all of those things, and that in monastic life as well, there's this, because we're human beings, even if we've taken vows, that there's this penchant toward fragmentation. Time spent in prayer and rest, for which one needs to make a commitment, is never wasted time, and in fact it enriches all the rest of life. And the fragmentation of life, which each of us experiences, is not solved by putting prayer or contemplation or rest on a level playing field with all of the other obligations which intrude upon us, but rather making a commitment to habits of Sabbath, habits of solitude, habits of service, these things which give real rest to the human soul. That makes us more effective, more vibrant, more capable of living fully and well in other ways. And so you've got so many hours in a day. And what's amazing is, do you remember at the end of Mere Christianity, C.S. Lewis he has a chapter titled The New Men or something, where he says what it'll be like to meet real Christians. And one phrase has stuck with me all through my life: they'll seem to have more time than anyone else. And when you seem to be helping them, they'll actually be helping you. And this is very interesting. They'll seem to have more time than anyone else. Is it true that time given to God is never wasted? If that's true, then we have to commit to it and watch what happens. But that's an act of faith. And in America, we can't do it. Every cell of our blood, it's all gravitates against that. We are activists. So that's why we die of high blood pressure and heart disease. All right.
One more.
At our college, we have our students take a course called Benedict. There's Chittis, there's Bookers, and we still from the daily. And students come into it resistant to it. And I tell them that it's a fantastic course, and it's going to be one time in their life. They are going to have time to really sit down and think about their lives. And that part of what this is about is becoming aware of the fact that every day and every decision they make, they are creating their lives and themselves, and they're doing it in relation to God. And Chittister does a chapter on holy leisure, and that it isn't wasted time, it is very important. And the students in their papers, they talk about starting to get this and wanting balance in their lives and the importance of it.
You know, this connects to the first question that was asked, because one of the advantages of our institutions is that most of us are of a scale where we don't surrender the teaching of the core curriculum such that we can really put our master teachers, so to speak, at the head of courses like that. Do you know what I mean? In other words, in lots of places which are so large, the core courses are courses which are taught by brand new teachers or which everybody with all of their will and every ounce of their desire, even the teacher, are waiting to graduate from, to get out of. But if indeed we arrange things such that the importance of those courses, like the Wisdom of Benedict or philosophy and theology courses, if those courses which teach more than marketable skills are taught by the very best that we've got, that's something that we're able to do, and when we do it, then we convince them.
And I went to that class kicking and screaming. And I'm not gonna lie, I did not want to teach this class, but it was partly, nobody could tell me one sentence, what is this class about? But for me, I now volunteer to teach the class, because it also reminds me what I need to do, that I need to have balance in my life. And I do reflection papers in my classes, because I am trying to get them to just stop and think and understand the importance of what we teach.
Right. Good to be with you, everybody. Thanks so much.